Welcome everybody to the April webinar. 4 months into the year 2022 already. Time flies when you're having fun. Nevertheless, we are happy to have you join us here today for another European Specialty Tea Association webinar to learn, connect, and inspire tea professionals everywhere. I'm Bernadine Tay, one of the founding directors of ESTA, along with my colleagues, Alexis Carr, also founding director, and David Veal, managing director of ESTA. Now, as an association, we are champions of specialty tea, but we also love to champion specialty botanicals as it is a key part of any good tea menu and certainly part of the tea ritual enjoyment as well. And today we are going to be introduced to the honeybush plant. Now it's very, very similar, as I understand, to its better known cousin, rooibos. It has many flavors, amazing health benefits, and we'll be learning about the challenges around its sustainable and regenerative cultivation as well. Now, honeybush might very well be the next big thing. So today I am so pleased to have with us Daniel Fourie. Did I say that correctly, Daniel?
Yes.
And he is a regenerative agricultural specialist and the company manager at the Langkloof Honeybush company in South Africa. I'd love to give you the chance to ask Daniel questions, and you can do this by posting them in the Q&A box anytime during the session, and we'll do our best to address your questions at the end of the session. So for the next 35 to 40 minutes, sit back, relax, and sip some tea. Welcome, Daniel. It's a pleasure to have you here today. Before we begin the presentation, can I ask you, as we ask every guest on our webinar, what does specialty tea mean to you?
Thank you very much, Bernadine. For me, specialty tea means it's the relationship between the tea drinker and the tea producer. It means that you're willing to appreciate that cup of tea and appreciate it far more than just the taste of the tea, but go the extra mile and learn where that tea came from and what makes it so special. And at the same time, it's that producer who puts that energy in, the farmer who puts the effort into producing an excellent product that can be appreciated by the tea drinker. So to me, it's that bridge, the relationship from the tea drinker to the farmer. So, yeah.
I love it. Well said. Thank you so much. Now we're very, very excited to hear from you, and after which I'm sure we'll get some questions from everybody here as well. So why don't I hand you the floor and you can share your presentation, and we'll be right back to have anybody's questions answered.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Over to you.
I just need to enable the sharing, please. David?
I'm so sorry. Let me help you.
Hello, Daniel. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. It just says that it's disabled. The screen sharing is disabled.
I'll help you.
Okay. Okay. Can you do that, Lily?
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to make you a co-host, Daniel. So sorry about that. Check
No
now
problem.
if it's going to work.
Yes, there we go. Okay. So thank you very much, Bernadine, for the introduction. My name is Daniel Fourie, and I've got a quick disclaimer to make. As David mentioned, you like to hear about botanicals, and in South Africa, honeybush is considered a tea. Just like rooibos, we always call it tea, even though it's not the Camellia sinensis and it is considered a botanical. So you must please excuse me if I do slip up every now and then in the presentation and refer to honeybush as a tea instead of a botanical. It is just, let's say, ingrained since birth that it's a tea. So this is a quick disclaimer. So today I'll talk to you about the multiple flavors and functions of the honeybush plant. I'll give you guys a quick introduction to the Langkloof Honeybush company. briefly overview what is honeybush, the origin, botany, the production of honeybush, some of the traditional uses and medicinal benefits, the flavor profiles, and then I'll go into a little bit of cultivation and specifically focus on regenerative agriculture. My speciality is actually as a soil microbiologist, and so the soil and the cultivation side is where I'm far more comfortable, and the honeybush is new to me and something that I'm very passionately learning about and learning to appreciate. So the Langkloof Honeybush Company is a social enterprise that was founded by Grounded, and we came into the Langkloof area in South Africa to look how we could grow the honeybush industry, to take this unique plant, which is under a lot of threat in terms of over-harvesting in this landscape, and how we could build a company and a market around this plant to make it sustainable and provide a good livelihood to farmers and harvesters who are involved in the harvesting and processing of these plants. So honeybush is not actually just a single plant. It's a group of plants, 23 species in the Cyclopia genus. They are all endemic to the fynbos biome it's the southwestern strip in South Africa. It's the only place on earth where these plants grow. They need, very similar to rooibos, they need these acidic soils to be able to grow. And as far as I know, they haven't been successfully cultivated anywhere on earth. There are 23 species of Cyclopia, but commonly there's about 5 species that are fermented and commercially used and sold as honeybush. And our company and the area that we work in, there are 2 species that we are mainly focused on, Cyclopia intermedia, which is called the Bergtia, and Cyclopia septenata, which is called the Flatia. And I'll go into a little bit more detail why they've got those specific names. So just to give you an idea of the geography or the area that we grow in, this map here is the whole Southern Cape region of South Africa. So the most southerly tip of Africa. And these 5 different species are the most commonly distributed through this area. All of these Cyclopia species grow wild, and the majority of honeybush is still actually wild harvested, but there's been mismanagement or misharvesting in the past, and so many of these species are threatened or declining and even endangered in their natural habitats, and thus special care needs to be taken to make sure that over-harvesting doesn't happen and that this resource can be sustainably used. So, like I mentioned, the majority of honeybush is still wild harvested. Here on the left-hand side, you can see the mountains. This is the typical terrain where this would be the Cyclopia intermedia, the Bergtia grows, which Bergtia is directly translated as mountain tea. So it would grow in these high south-facing slopes. And then for cultivated tea, the Cyclopia septenata, which is the Flatia, which is faster growing and likes a wetter habitat. So vlei in Afrikaans is a wetland. So it's a wetland tea essentially. Is cultivated in, let's say, traditional agricultural settings. We focus a lot of our effort on wild harvesting tea, even though it's a huge effort. The typical procedure is that harvesters would go up into the mountains and they cut off 75 to 80% of the bush, so the whole plant above ground, stems and leaves, everything, bundle it up into 30 to 40 kilo bundles, and then they have to hike back down out of the mountains. Typically, they would be walking 1 to 2 kilometers in a day up and down, collecting bundles of this tea, of the honeybush, and then taking it down to a pickup point where it would go through to a processing facility. So like I mentioned, there are some serious challenges with the sustainable harvesting of honeybush. A few years ago, about 5 years ago, honeybush went through a boom, and the amount of honeybush that was being produced shot up from an average of 150 to 250 tons a year up to 750 tons a year. And it sparked, say, it was almost an ecological catastrophe, because people went in and started harvesting, over-harvesting the populations. You had a lot of theft, so poaching of honeybush. And then we're also facing more long-term challenges like habitat loss due to alien invasive species. Pine, black wattles are big problems in these areas. And then also even longer-term challenges from climate change. So we are getting more and more frequent fires and droughts, which are also threatening this this honeybush, or all fynbos for that matter. So we work together with local partners and farmers and the harvesters to set up sustainable harvesting practices. That includes going out into the mountains, doing resource assessments, creating sustainable harvesting plans, training harvesters on correct procedures, and then also actually verifying harvests, so that we make sure that there's full traceability from the farm where it was cut, right the way through to the processor, and then all the way through to the final client that buys the honeybush at the end of the day. And in that way, we hope to show, give an example of how the right way is to harvest this natural resource, and hopefully help preserve the resource for the long term. So briefly on the processing, honeybush, like I mentioned, is the whole plant, the whole top of the plant material. It's mostly actually stems. So the stem will be cut when, for the wild tea, the intermediate tea, when it's about 4 years old, and it's about as thick as your pinky finger. Then that whole plant material, leaves and stems, go through a chopper, which cuts it into a finer particle size. And then it goes through a very high temperature fermentation. It's actually an oxidation process, so it's not a microbial fermentation like rooibos is, for instance, or some black teas. It's oxidized at a high temperature in a steam vat, often a steam injected vat, between 60 to 80 degrees Celsius for a couple of hours. The reason for this is because the material that you're oxidizing is very woody material. It's quite hard. It needs that high intense heat to release the phytochemicals and allow the oxidation process to happen. And honeybush is also very high in antioxidant levels, so the highest antioxidant levels, and it needs that additional push to oxidize fully. So the final product is usually a deep brown, red, almost maroon color tea or botanical, which is a coarse grain. So we usually have 3 grains that come out: a coarse cut, a fine cut, and a super fine cut. And the particle sizes are fairly uniform, a square particle, and it's actually the wood. You can see it's the wood or the stem of the plant rather than the leaves. The leaves tend to be the small particles or even the dust. They often don't stay whole through the fermentation process. So the fynbos is a super diverse group of different plant species here, like I said, endemic to the Cape floristic region. And these plants have a fantastic traditional use as medicinal plants. So the original people, the Khoi and the San people, would have used the Cyclopia plant as, amongst other fynbos species, as a medicinal plant. Unfortunately, it's an oral tradition, and the knowledge around how these peoples would have used the plants is fairly lost. There's very little that has been written down, and just anecdotal evidence from the early settlers, the early colonists who came to Africa in the 1800s, show that talk about how these peoples would have used the plants. There's no clear evidence that it was ever used as part of their culinary tradition. So that it doesn't seem that they ever brewed a tea from the honeybush, but definitely used honeybush as a medicinal plant. From the 1800s onwards, there's a lot of clear, a lot more records as the early Dutch and English colonists came to Southern Africa. They, in their interactions with the local peoples, they found these indigenous plants and used them as substitutes for what they called China tea at that time, or the Camellia sinensis plant. Because these early colonists, it was very expensive for them to get tea. They'd have to import it in on ships. They made use of what was around them, and it's believed that these early the indigenous people, the San and the Khoi, shared their herbal knowledge with the early settlers, and the fermentation process was obviously brought from the Camellia sinensis processing methods, and they used that on the honeybush. And in that way, they've started developing honeybush tea as a substitute for English or Chinese tea, as they called it at that time. And a lot of the early records show that honeybush was used as a restorative beverage. So for common ailments such as stomach upsets, mild flu symptoms, skin problems, and the like. And yeah, it became the common man's beverage here in South Africa, and that has continued to this day. So honeybush has been fairly slow in commercialization, and compared to rooibos, for instance, and only recently has proper research started into honeybush, and a large portion of this research is focused on the health benefits of honeybush. And it's come out that honeybush has got some amazing health properties. So for instance, honeybush has got the highest antioxidant levels of any of the commonly consumed teas or botanicals, so even higher than matcha. If you score it on the ORAC assay, which is a common assay that they use to test how much antioxidant levels there are. But there's a host of important phytochemicals that are contained within this honeybush plant, and these high antioxidants have been shown to have strong anti-cancer properties, skin protection or photoprotection properties, anti-obesity, anti-diabetic properties. And yeah, there's a lot of research now being done on honeybush extracts, most notably for the anti-cancer. So there's phytoestrogens which are present in the honeybush plant, which have been shown to be very supportive for female hormonal balances and hormonal health. And it's a lot of research now is being done into using honeybush or as a, say, to reduce the risk of certain types of cancers like breast cancer, for instance. So The flavor profile of honeybush has also been extensively researched in the last few years. And here you can see a flavor wheel that was developed by the Agricultural Research Council here in South Africa. Because honeybush is it's more than just a single botanical. It's, like I said, it's a group of species, and because you're wild harvesting, there's huge variations in the taste profiles. Obviously the most common aromatic that you get is this honey flavor, but there's, as you go through, there's a lot of fruity, sweet notes that you'll pick up. Often orange, apricots, things like cooked apple comes through, and especially on this intermediate species, you often get a milder yet deep woody and nutty flavors that come through, where the subtenata species, which is the cultivated species, are often more intense with flavor in their flavors and much sweeter flavors. Now, honeybush is commonly used these days as a blend, as a botanical for making flavored blends, and it lends itself very well to this because it brings a sweetness and it supports the other flavors that are blended with it. Although I do think that there's too little appreciation for the pure honeybush on its own, especially if you've got a really good intermediate, a bergteer that's been wild harvested, and specially selected a single batch. There's a depth of flavor there that is very worth exploring. So jumping over into the cultivation of the honeybush and a little bit of the regenerative agriculture. Honeybush is still a wild plant. It is something that we've started working to cultivate or to tame, but the problem that we find is that it takes 2 to 3 years to harvest this plant once it's been planted, and then after 4 to 5 years there's numerous diseases that attack the honeybush plants. Like I mentioned, the subtenata species is the faster growing species, and that's often the one that's used for cultivation, just so that farmers can get a quick return. But the problem is that these fields don't last, and that's why cultivation is still very expensive. And when the market demand is low, wild harvesting obviously takes preference. So we work with the local community. We've set up a honeybush nursery with trial plots to try and to do research into honeybush cultivation as well, because although the supply and the demand are matching up at the moment, as soon as the industry grows again, the wild population, it can only supply so much tea, and then it will become unsustainable again, and you need a cultivated honeybush as an alternative to move into. So we work on multiple levels. One of the important things with honeybush is to do with the microbiology. So because honeybush is from the pea family, Fabaceae, it has the ability to form symbiotic relationships with microorganisms called rhizobacteria. They are nitrogen fixing microorganisms, and they're very specific to the plant itself. So what we found was if you plant the plants out in healthy soils, then the bacteria is present already. But as soon as you start planting out into cultivated soils where the soil has been damaged, then these bacteria aren't present. So we do things like extract these rhizobium bacteria, grow them out in the lab, and then re-inoculate the seed of the honeybush before planting them out, to try and boost the let's say survival rate and the health of these honeybush plants. We also look at other regenerative practices like cover crops, mulching the plants, inoculating with different types of composts and different methods of irrigation. So a large part of what we do is research on regenerative agriculture and regenerative techniques to support the plant health. And I say plant health, but it's actually supports soil health. So regenerative farming, and I'll jump over here into what I'm more comfortable with and what my speciality actually is. Regenerative farming is a set of techniques and practices that you can use to support soil health and in turn then support plant health. Instead of trying to fight disease and feed the plant, you rather feed the soil and support the soil so that its natural function can then support the plants. In a previous life, I was a rosemary farmer up in the Karoo region in South Africa, and one of the practices that we employed there was the use of cover crops. So here you can see the rows of rosemary, and between them, these aren't weeds, these are planted pastures essentially. These are permanent cover crops of lucerne, clover, plantain, a diverse mixture of crops that we plant between the rosemary plants for these benefits. So the cover crops keep the soil covered, they retain moisture, feed the soil microorganisms. So it's very important to have a diversity of crops. A polyculture, which is what you call it when you plant multiple crops together, there's a high diversity of plants and microorganisms then. And I like to compare it to, a city that's alive and a culture, and there's a lot of diversity and individuals, and together the city, let's say, grows and it builds. Whereas if you look at a monoculture, it's more like a concentration camp or a prison where everyone has to dress the same way and they have to stand in lines, and it's a sick society in a prison, and there's constant decline in the health of these individuals in a monoculture like that. So, and plants are exactly the same. They need that diversity around them to be able to thrive. So these regenerative practices are mainly focused on supporting soil microbiology, and then in turn the soil microbiology supports the plant health. So we focus on creating as much diversity in the soil as possible. Here you can see, for instance, it's a fungal strand at high magnification, 400 times magnification, with all these little dots here of bacteria around it. And what happens is plants and soil microorganisms have a symbiotic relationship. Plants will produce sugars from sunlight, and they'll excrete these sugars into the soil as it's called a root exudate. And in turn, the microorganisms receive these sugars from the plants as their food source, and they trade essentially with the plant. They give the plant minerals and water and other nutrients, even some hormones and protective compounds that the plant needs to thrive then. And what you get is what's called a microbiome forming around the plant roots. This on the right-hand side is wheat plants, and the soil that's stuck to that root is called a rhizosheath. So that's that layer. It's very dense with a high diversity of microorganisms, and you find that there's an amazing interaction, a trade going on between the plant giving sugars to these microorganisms and these microorganisms supporting the plant in turn. But you need that diversity there. You need all these microorganisms to be present. To each one of them fulfills a very specific function for that plant. And as soon as humans come in and we use chemical fertilizers or pesticides or fungicides or herbicides, all these sides which are killing cyan means it's a killing chemical, we knock out some of these microorganisms and we destroy this natural function that exists in the soil. And then we have to just keep doing it. We have to keep adding fertilizer, and we have to keep adding fertilizer because we've destroyed the natural system that's in place to feed the plant. So one easy way to quickly move into a regenerative system, especially for perennial growers, people who are farming with like a Camellia sinensis plant, or the rosemary that I was farming with, is the use of composts and compost teas. And a compost extract is essentially you just dissolve these really good compost in water. These microorganisms thrive in this semi-aquatic environment, and you then inoculate your soil with these beneficial microorganisms. And in that way, you stimulate that diversity, and you bring that diversity back. And I've seen it do amazing things for soils that have been very degraded and over-farmed in their life. And you start bringing this diversity of microorganisms back, and you kickstart that natural process again, and you move back to the way that plants actually like living in the soil and interacting with these soil microorganisms. So yeah, I hope that gives a nice overview of the Langkloof Honeybush company in terms of that we're looking at this wonderful botanical, this honeybush, and this is a unique species, but we're looking at it far more in depth. We're looking at it at the sustainable wild harvesting, but also the sustainable cultivation and the regenerative agriculture practices that go into supporting the making of this wonderful product that we are then very proud to give to the tea drinker, so that they can enjoy that cup of tea. And yeah, I hope it's just a small glimpse into the effort that goes into making that cup of tea. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it.
Daniel, thank you very, very much. That was super interesting. And, you know, we've just been chatting with some of the audience as well. And we definitely have some Honeybush fans here. So Carol and Begonia have said that they absolutely love Honeybush, and, you know, once they tasted it. So it's no wonder. And I said to you yesterday, I believe also that, you know, not like tea, not all Honeybush are made equally, because I have definitely not tasted any Honeybush like what you describe. So really, really interesting. Now, how would you describe the Honeybush flavor? A really, really good Honeybush. How would you describe it?
So to me, it starts with the aroma. I think that the smell of Honeybush first is the thing that catches you first. When you bring that cup to your nose, there's a strong honeybush, a strong honey flavor, that was strong honey aroma. And you can actually, when you walk in the field, in the veld, what we call veld is the bush, when the honey bush is in flower, it makes these beautiful yellow blooms. You get that same sweet honey flavor, and then you take a sip, and it starts off very high, sweet caramel, apricot, citrus flavors, you know, very fruity flavors, and then there's I don't know how to explain it, the slight acidity that brings you into these woody, deeper, like sometimes spicy notes as well. Cinnamon comes out often. Some earthy notes as well. So there's a minerality to it as well, that as you explore past that intense sweetness, if I can put it that way, that you find this earthiness at the bottom of it.
Yeah, sounds absolutely lovely. And I believe you know, David, it will be sending me a sample to have a little taste. So I'm very, very excited. David, would you concur with Daniel's description?
I would, and I was drinking some when we had our pre-meeting yesterday, and I just shared a bit of it. As I took quite a long time to drink my cup, so when I got to the end, it was quite a lot cooler, and the sweetness seemed to intensify. And then we had a discussion about whether I was getting apricots or apricot jam, but it was certainly a really rich, sweet, fruity flavour. It's delicious, and I can see exactly why it is popular as a blend, but really people should try it on its own because it's fantastic flavor.
Interesting. Maybe Daniel, you can clarify this, because Helena, who is in our audience today, she says she's confused because and it's a common misconception, isn't it, that Honeybush is the same as rooibos. So it really it's not unique to Helena. It's quite a popular misconception, isn't it? Would you like to explain that a little bit more about the difference in the type of plant it comes from?
Yeah, definitely. So both plants are from the same family, from the Fabaceae family of plants, which is the pea family. So the same as peas or beans and those types of things. But that's pretty much where the similarity stops. The rooibos is typically grown on the western coast of South Africa in a much drier, sandier climate. It's a much finer plant as well, and it's got small leaves. It's almost needle-like. The whole plant is also harvested and fermented, whereas honeybush is like a big shrub. Sometimes even it looks like a small tree or something like that, in like proper big wild honeybush plants. And like I mentioned there, it's the branches that's actually used to produce the tea from it. And they do have some similar flavors in terms of a sweetness and a caramel type flavor, but the honeybush is often considered to be much sweeter and obviously more honey focused, honey flavored. But
hence
they're very,
the name.
yes, and I think the rooibos makes it's more the color of the tea that you get, which is what it's distinctive for. And interestingly enough, rooibos also has slightly higher tannin levels, so you can't brew. Rooibos is one of those things where you have to brew it for 3 to 5 minutes and then actually take the tea bag out or strain the tea out. Where honeybush has almost no tannins in it, so it never becomes bitter. You can brew it indefinitely almost, and often traditionally with the farmers in the area, what they do is they make up a pot, like a coffee pot, a tin pot of very strong honeybush tea that they would put on their coal stoves in their homes, and then throughout the day this tea would be slowly cooking away, and they would just top it up with water, and it never becomes bitter, or it never becomes astringent. You can just keep drinking it all day long without having to strain. So that's one other difference.
That sounds ideal for, busy moms who are taking care of the family, because I know a lot of women who have children say the tea always gets cold and they never get to finish it. So that sounds idyllic, for women with children out there. So it's a very, very good option. And best also, it doesn't have caffeine. So, you'd be guaranteed a good sleep at night. Daniel, I have a question, a very good question actually, from Emily Holmes in the audience. Now, why did rooibos become so successful versus the honeybush? One would expect the name to have helped the latter to do better at a global level. That's very interesting. I think I'd really like to know, do you have an answer for that?
Yeah, so it was actually politically driven. The previous apartheid government in South Africa had invested quite heavily into the rooibos industry and had subsidized it quite heavily, and how can I say it, promoted the growth of rooibos throughout the world. because it was an easier plant to farm. So because it was easier to cultivate, they could control it, and they took this plant and started cultivating it broadly. And in that way, it was like a crop that they focused on through subsidies and promoted heavily. Where the honeybush is, because it's wild harvested, and it was actually the harvesters who knew where the plants were growing, it was very difficult to control and to formalize, if I can put it that way. So it stayed much more of a cottage industry until very recently, when people started appreciating that you can actually, that you can actually source from these smaller farms, and you can, without it having to be this huge commodity market. So I think the specialty tea in this market is really helping honeybush grow at this stage.
That's very interesting. And you see they grow in the wild. Do they grow from seed? Is that how they reproduce?
So it's an interesting plant because it requires fire for the seed to germinate. So a lot of fynbos actually, it requires it becomes hard, the felt, what we call, and then you require a fire to come through and burn down the felt, and then that seed only germinates when it's exposed to smoke and heat. And the honeybush has got a very clever little mechanism. It's got a small, like a piece of protein on the seed, where ants then grab that, they want to eat that piece of protein, and then they carry that seed down into their holes, into the ant nests, to eat that piece of protein, and the seed stays safe in that ant nest, so that when the fire comes over, it's at exactly the right depth, if I can put it that way, that it doesn't get too hot to kill the seed, but then the seed is like surrounded by fertilizer from the ants and so on, and then it can just shoot forth very quickly, and it resprouts very quickly after fire then. So
that is fascinating. David, you have a question? Did you raise your hand there?
Yes, I did. Yes, I've got a couple of questions actually, Daniel. Before I ask them, though, there's been a bit of discussion in the chat room about where to pose questions. Well, you can put them in chat, but it's easier for us to manage if you put them in Q&A. So if anybody does have any questions, please just put them in Q&A. Daniel will answer them. My first question for you, Daniel, you very well explained the difference between wild honeybush and cultivated honeybush, and the challenges of cultivating it. In terms of the end product, is there much difference in taste between the two, and quality also?
So yes, well, because the two are mostly different species, so the wild tea is mostly intermedia, although you do get some subtonata that's harvested there, and the cultivated tea is mostly subtonata. There is that taste difference just naturally. Also, it's been picked up that sometimes if the farmer is over fertilizing and over watering the plants, it's like the plant loses intensity of taste. I don't know how to explain it. It becomes a watery. It produces a watery tea, or
like a thin. Very thin, yeah.
Exactly. So I don't know if that's something that, I think it's also something that affects Camellia sinensis if it's very intensively cultivated, under chemical cultivation. But so there's some arguments like that. But to be honest, you need to be a connoisseur to be able to really tell those differences. You need to be drinking a couple of cups of honeybush before you can start to tell that type of difference.
Okay, thank you. Also, I was interested in when you talked about this bad year a couple of years ago, when production went crazy and it went from 200 tons to 750, and the ecological disaster that came from that. So just going back to your average 200 to 250 tons per annum, is there much scope for increasing that in a managed way? Keeping the quality and not destroying the environment.
So we're trying very hard. So the natural populations are picking up again. Naturally, we think that you can support at least 500 tons a year wild harvested tea. So that's what we think is possible in South Africa and sustainably. The problem is you have to then manage it properly. So you have to come in every 4 years and cut blocks, and you have to. And then on the cultivated side, there's a huge scope for the honeybush cultivation, especially if you start bringing in these regenerative systems. So one thing that we're looking at is, how can I explain it? It's like a honeybush agroforestry system where we're planting out the slower growing honeybush in a mix with proteas and other fynbos species that all have some economic value. So proteas, obviously it's the cut flower industry, aloe ferox, which is this aloe lump, and to combine different species together in these marginal agricultural zones, it's as if you're rehabilitating what the natural felt should be able to do. But then you're still doing it in a cultivated way so that you can increase the amount of tea that you can get. So it's things like that we're trying to keep it natural, but increase the output that you can get.
And within your regenerative system, what will be the average life of a bush before you have to replace it?
We're not sure yet. We're at year 4 now on our trial plots, and the plants are looking very healthy, and they look good. In the wild, it's a guess, but anything from 12 to 30 years that these plants should be able to keep being productive. That's sort of the normal lifespan. That's what we're aiming for, is that we can actually replicate that.
Yeah, okay. And when you said that when you're harvesting, you more or less just take the top of the bush completely. Do you need to then indulge in further pruning, or does that act as pruning as well as harvesting?
It's the harvest and the prune. It's all in one shot. So the intermediate, we cut it down to almost to the ground, and it resprouts. So then it will shoot those, and it will take 4 years to grow back into a big enough bush to harvest. Yeah. The subtenata, the cultivated species, that's far more like pruning. So we cut the bush down so that you prune it so that there's some core sticks or shoots that are left over, and then they resprout, and then you prune them back. So, but it's a single harvest once a year. So it's not like Camellia sinensis where you're just taking a small cuts of the new growth off, because we're taking the branch. Actually, we have to take that whole year's growth.
Okay, thank you. Well, I do have other questions, but if anybody else has some, I don't want to hold the show.
Just on this topic, and then I'll go to Emily's question. So does it have to be oxidized, or can it be left unoxidized? You know, like rooibos, it has green and red. Which is it the same for honeybush?
It is definitely the same. So you do get green honeybush. It's not well known, which I'm surprised, because it's a very nice when it's green. It's got more vegetative flavors, so more like grassy, bushy flavors. I'm learning about the Camellia sinensis now, but I think it's like comparing a white tea to a oolong, something like that, where the green tea would be a much earthier,
grassy, like delicate vegetable,
but it's still surprisingly, it still produces that honey. To me, it's a more pure honey flavor. So it doesn't have these caramel or like burnt sugar, cooked sugar notes. It's a much cleaner honey, more fine floral honey, and it's delicious. I mean, the green honey
it's really
bush,
lovely.
so worth drinking on its own.
So Emily then asked the really good question, which I'd like to know as well. Should we as specialty tea buyers be buying cultivated versus wild honeybush? Then if we are, because we're after a flavoursome yet sustainable tea, should we be doing that?
It's you need to buy the right honeybush for the right purpose. So if you want a special, let's say the honeybush only for its flavor, I would suggest then you look at a wild harvested tea that you know is coming from a single source, and you can taste that mountain. And there's some really nice honeybush tea estates that they specifically they only harvest that tea that they can wild harvest in a year, and that's that for their supply. Then so that's if you want to enjoy the honeybush on its own for that honeybush flavor and for that experience. Whereas the cultivated honeybush, don't get me wrong, it's got a wonderful flavor on its own, much sweeter, especially if you want to drink it, let's say more regularly, and kids love it, for instance, as like a healthy iced tea or something like that, low sugar iced tea that's still sweet. But it lends itself, in my opinion, much more to blending with other botanicals. So there you can, do amazing things. Like we've got a orange and cocoa husk blend that we make, which just it just brings out those citrus and that chocolatiness. It rounds it off nicely. So I think there's definitely a space for using it as a blended product as well. And there, the cultivated tea, because it's got a much sweeter and more intense flavor, works very well as well. So each one has its purpose, if I can put it that way, and then you just need to use the right one for the right purpose.
That sounds good. One question from Alexis, actually. Can honeybush be used as an ingredient in food?
I'm not sure. I've got a colleague, she's a botanist, and she's constantly experimenting with honeybush. So I know she's made a honeybush gin. That's quite a popular one, is to make a gin, like extract of honeybush, and a honeybush skin scrub. The closest I've gone to using honeybush in food was actually as to smoke food. So you use it instead of something like apple wood chips, because it's the wood, it's a woody, it's got that, it brings a very nice flavor, but fairly intense. You need to smoke it lightly. But if you're going to smoke some trout or something like that, it's I've done it before, and it imparts a nice flavor. But I can't say that I've experimented with it beyond that. Probably nice in puddings or something.
Oh, that sounds really lovely. David, do you want to ask Daniel your question?
The other question I had, Daniel, was the point you made about health benefits to the female part of the population. And you were quite strong there, made sort of stronger claims than I've heard from any other sort of products. Is that a unique selling point, do you think? Is it, given that, the tea drinking, certainly within speciality, we have more females than males within the association. We're about 60 to 70% of our membership is female. So, maybe you've got you're onto a winner here.
Yeah. So, look, traditionally in South Africa, honeybush has been used by women with small babies. So, to support breastfeeding, they often give it to the babies as a help for colic or stomach upsets and those types of things, because it's a low caffeine, it's got no caffeine and good health benefits. Traditionally here in South Africa, we've always used it. I grew up on rooibos or honeybush when I was growing up, and the research these days, or the research currently happening, is more for like concentrated extracts. that they want to make out of the honeybush. But to me, whether you take a small pill, which is a really concentrated extract of honeybush, or you drink 3 cups of tea a day, I'd much rather drink the 3 cups of tea a day and still get those same benefits. I think sometimes, and I mean, it is scientific. Well, there's a lot of scientific backing behind it. We've got an organization in South Africa called Cancer, which is CanSA, which is the Cancer Research Institute, or it's like a public body that funds cancer research. And they even published that this research that shows that honeybush has got these, let's say, preventative benefits for preventing breast cancer, for instance. So, it's definitely something that's important, and it's an important selling point, but I don't think it should be the only reason why you want to drink something like honeybush either. So.
Yeah. Speaking of the health benefits, I think Begonia, who's in the audience, says that she's made an infusion loaded with honeybush and use it as a substitute. Fantastic fruity and herbal body, and left my skin feeling fantastic. I made a tincture to use mixed in my facial oil, and it was great. So because you were saying that there's lots of products out there with honeybush in South Africa, isn't it?
Yeah, so rooibos especially, but honeybush is coming up now. It's like a natural sunscreen, if I can put it that way. It protects your skin cells from UV damage. So it's becoming very popular as an ingredient in let's say cosmetics as well. And yeah, that's exactly the right. You make a very strong tincture of it, and it's Also, if you just drink it cleanses your skin, so it removes acne and things like that as well. So
sounds like it's got a lot going for it. I think my biggest takeaway was the findings that the antioxidant levels are higher than matcha, which is potentially disruptive to the wellness market. So do you have any more details about the research that has taken place?
I can point you to the different research that's being done at the moment. There's several South African universities, and we've got something called the Medical Research Council, MRC, in South Africa, that are all doing research on these health benefits. And like I said, at this stage, it's mostly focused on the anti-cancer or cancer preventative properties of honeybush. But yeah, scientific research like this also takes a long time to build enough evidence to say, okay, this thing cures cancer or something like that. So there's a larger amount of traditional knowledge behind it as well. And it's one of those things, if it tastes nice, why not just drink a cup a day to stay healthy?
Indeed.
I can put it that way.
Yeah, you've also got to enjoy what you drink, because that's also, makes you happy as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, Begonia has just put in a question to us. Are there some scientific research about honeybush as sunscreen that you can share?
I will have to check. The one article that I did read said that it has these skin it's photo protective, so it protects skin cells from sun damage, but I haven't read the article where they actually researched that. So it was as a by note in one of the article about the the cancer. But I can look for it and I will share whatever I can find, definitely.
That will be amazing. Yeah, thank you very much. Last question came in from Alexis as well. What countries import honeybush?
Geez, I think most of the countries that are actively involved in the tea trade. So we export to Germany. A lot of the tea that we're selling is going to Germany. I know that it goes to the Far East as well. A lot of Honeybush and Rooibos actually goes to China, and via China then to the normal tea market. The countries that are known or that appreciate, I can call it that way, appreciate Honeybush for what it is Japan, most definitely. So some of the best tea estates it's tea farms that I know, they just harvest and export to Japan. The Japanese people, for some reason, really love Honeybush, and so they're the ones that really appreciate it for the speciality, just for drinking Honeybush on its own. When most of these other, it goes to Germany and then it goes to these big tea houses, and they just use it in their blends or as a filler or a flavored product in the different blends that they make up, and then they obviously send it off to the rest of Europe and the US and places like that. So I can say that the Japanese people, as far as I've heard, are the ones that really appreciate Honeybush the most at this stage.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Diana says that was very, very interesting information. Last question, Alexis says, what is the shelf life of Honeybush if she wanted to sell it?
We suggest 6 years. It's from tests that have been done and so on, the tea doesn't lose the antioxidant properties because it's very woody and it's very dry. It seems shelf stable for up to 6 years, but we think that it can last for much longer than that. But we have to put a best before date, so we put 6 years on the tea. The tea does change a little bit over time as it stores, and I don't think it's like a pu'er that's fermenting slowly over time or something like that. But the intensity of the sweetness changes, and it becomes more woody and earthy as it ages, is what I've noticed. But it's better to start with fresher tea if you want all of those flavor notes present, if I can put it that way.
Sounds good. Well, thank you very much for your time. I think we have no more questions, certainly from not my side. David, have you got all your questions answered on Honeybush?
Yes, thank you, Daniel. That was excellent.
Yes, it was really excellent, very, very informative. Like I said, I can't wait to taste some. I definitely have a whole new understanding of Honeybush, and I think the audience really appreciated your insight as well. So really, really massive thank you for your time on this. And I also want to thank everybody for joining us here today. I really hope you will join us for our next webinar in May, because it's going to be a really interesting one as well. If you want to know why tea suppliers who concentrate on selling local teas, they will be the ones earning the highest profits. And it is going to be delivered by Dan Bolton, who will join us next month. And the topic is why tea's chaotic, fragmented markets are a matter of taste. It's truly going to be fascinating. So please do join us. As usual, the European Tea Association exists to raise the standards of tea everywhere. And we do this by embracing innovation. We share knowledge like this and encourage collaboration as well. And one aim is to improve every cup of tea that is served and to make sure our producers get a fair price for their efforts to make better tea. We are not-for-profit organization, and we exist because of the wonderful volunteers from all over the world that help us bring great content, education programs, and events. And to do this, of course, we rely very heavily on membership as well. And we have different types of memberships for individuals, for businesses. So please do visit us on our website, specialityteaeurope.org. So
com.
.com,
Dot
I'm
com.
sorry. Yes, .com. Thank you, David. .com. I don't want to send you to outer space. But you know, if you have any questions for us, please do send us an email. If you have any further questions for Daniel, we'd be very, very happy to push it through to Daniel, or you can reach Daniel directly as well, but we're here to help. But for now, thank you very, very much, Daniel. Thank you everybody for joining. And for those of you that celebrate Easter, hope you have a really, really good Easter. So thank you so much. Till next month, take care and stay safe. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Bye.
Good
Bye.
night.